The rain had not stopped for 11 days. Miriam Vale sat on the porch of her rented room above the general store in Marshfield, watching the water cascade from the wooden awning in a steady curtain. Below, the streets of the town had become rivers of mud, and the few people who ventured out moved like specters beneath oiled canvas umbrellas, heads bowed against the endless gray. She was 26 years old, and she had exactly $43 to her name. For 2 years since arriving in Oregon from Missouri, she had worked as a seamstress, mending fishing nets, picking berries for the canning cooperative, doing whatever honest labor the frontier demanded. She had watched other women arrive with husbands and fathers, watched them build homes on solid ground, while she mended their clothes and mopped their floors. She had learned something valuable in those years of labor. Patience was not the same as waiting. Patience meant watching, listening, understanding the land before demanding anything from it. The claim auction had been announced 3 days ago. A parcel of marshland near the bay, nearly 200 acres of what the settlers called useless, too wet for grain, too acidic for potatoes, too wild for cattle. Previous claimants had abandoned it within months, leaving behind only a few rotting fence posts and a reputation for fool's errands. Miriam had walked the property in the brief sunshine between storms. She had knelt in the spongy soil and pressed her fingers into the earth. She had noticed what other settlers had ignored: thick mats of vine-like plants trailing small, hard berries the color of dried blood, wild cranberries, growing with abandon in soil that killed everything else. The auction was tomorrow. She would bid every dollar she had. In her small room, she inventoried her possessions: a worn trunk containing 2 dresses, a Bible her mother had given her before the fever took her, a kettle, a knife, a needle, and thread. Everything she owned could fit in a single wagon. Everything she had built her life upon was skill and stubbornness, and the absolute refusal to believe that a woman's place was anywhere other than exactly where she chose to stand. The rain hammered against the window. Somewhere in the marshlands, water was rising, filling the channels and low places, turning the useless land into a vast and churning wetland. The other settlers would be praying for the rain to stop, for the water to recede, for the sun to return and dry the earth into something manageable. Miriam pressed her palm against the cold glass and smiled. She was thinking about water, but not in the way they were thinking about it. She would go to the auction. She would offer everything she had, and then she would learn what the land was trying to teach her. The auction took place in the back room of the Coos Bay Land Office, a cramped space that smelled of tobacco and mildew. 7 men sat in folding chairs, looking bored or irritated. Not one of them planned to bid. Miriam stood near the door, her best dress still damp from the walk through town. She had brushed her hair until it shone and pressed her lips together until they hurt, trying to appear confident, established, like a woman who belonged on the frontier not as a servant, but as a homesteader. "This is Lot 47, the land agent announced, squinting at his papers. 206 acres, marshland, tidal influence, historically unsuitable for agriculture. Opening bid, $2. The room remained silent. One of the men coughed. Another checked his pocket watch. $2, the agent repeated, his voice flat with practiced disinterest. "I'll take it," Miriam said. Every head turned. The men stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. The land agent blinked twice. Ma'am, this property is— I know what it is, she interrupted. $2. A murmur rippled through the room. One of the older men leaned toward his neighbor and whispered something that made them both chuckle. Miriam felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she kept her spine straight and her expression calm. Very well. The agent's pen scratched against the paper. $43. That's the full payment for the claim. You'll need to file improvements within 6 months, or the land reverts. I understand. She counted out the bills from her pocket. Every coin she possessed, earned through 2 years of exhausting labor. The agent handed her a receipt. The men were already gathering their coats, already forgetting she existed, already telling the story to their wives and neighbors. The desperate seamstress who threw her money into a swamp. Miriam walked home through the rain, the receipt folded against her heart. She had no seed money left, no savings, no equipment, no husband to help break the land or build a shelter. She had only herself, the marsh, and the coming spring. For the next 3 weeks, she worked clearing the land, building a small cabin on the highest ground, hauling supplies through mud that grabbed at her boots and tried to pull them off. She dug a well and found water within inches of the surface, too wet for most crops, but perfect for what she had in mind. The wild cranberries grew everywhere, thicker than she had ever seen. They grew in the water, in the mud, in the spaces between pools where the tide came in and left behind rich sediment. The land that everyone mocked was covered with them, thousands upon thousands of plants, and not a single settler had thought to harvest them. Miriam began to experiment. She built a small raft from driftwood and floated into the bog, cutting the vines and gathering the berries into sacks. She dried them on racks above a small fire. She tasted them and found them tart, firm, packed with a flavor that sugar could not improve and did not need to. When she brought her first barrels of dried cranberries to the trading post in Marshfield, the merchant tasted one and ordered everything she had. Summer came to the Oregon coast with fog and intermittent sunshine. Miriam worked from dawn until dark, expanding her operation with every spare coin the merchant paid her. She built a system. Using hand tools and salvaged lumber, she carved shallow channels through the marsh, directing the flow of water to serve her purposes rather than fight against it. She constructed wooden walkways on stilts, elevated platforms that let her move through the bog without sinking into the muck. She fashioned floating harvest racks from pine planks and rope, platforms that rose and fell with the tide, keeping her berries dry while she gathered them. The settlers who had laughed at her watched from the edges of their dry, unproductive farms. Some shook their heads in wonder. Others offered congratulations that did not quite hide their confusion. A few asked questions. How did she know? What made her think? And she answered honestly. She did not know. She'd only watched and listened, and believed that the land would provide if she could learn its language. Her cabin grew into a small compound. She added a drying shed with a slate floor to catch the heat of the sun, walls that could be opened to let the coastal breeze speed the process, roof that protected the berries from rain that came without warning. She built a root cellar on higher ground, lined it with stone, stored her surplus where it would stay cool and fresh through the winter months. The first time she saw another woman on her land, she almost did not recognize her. The visitor was young, perhaps 19, with a hollow-cheeked face and hands that trembled from exhaustion. She introduced herself as Sarah, newly widowed, living in a tent near the mill with her 2 children and nowhere to go. "I heard you were hiring," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Miriam looked at the woman, at the children hanging back in the shadows, at the marsh stretching out behind them in all its impossible abundance. She remembered what it was to arrive with nothing, to be looked down upon by men who saw only a woman's frailty, to be offered scraps instead of chances. "Come," Miriam said. "I'll show you where to start." She taught Sarah how to identify the ripest berries, how to work the floating racks, how to dry and sort and pack. By the end of the first week, Sarah was earning more than any domestic position in Marshfield could offer. By the end of the month, she had moved into the cabin's spare room with her children, and the 2 women were working side by side, building something that neither could have built alone. Word spread. Other women came, widows, unmarried daughters of failing farms, mothers whose husbands had died or drifted away. Miriam hired them all. She taught them the marsh, shared her techniques, refused to patent her methods or hoard her knowledge. If the land wanted to give its gifts, she reasoned, then those gifts should flow to as many people as possible. By September, she had 12 women working the bog. They had harvested 3,000 pounds of dried cranberries. The merchant could not buy them fast enough. The letter arrived in October, carried by a circuit rider who stopped at the homestead on his weekly route. Miriam recognized the seal before she opened it. The Oregon State Agricultural Commission. She had written to them months ago, describing her operation, requesting information about formalizing a cooperative. Now they wanted to visit. They wanted to see the marsh claim for themselves. "They're sending someone?" Sarah asked, peering at the envelope as if it might bite. "Mr. Theodore Ashworth," Miriam read. "Agricultural surveyor. He's coming to assess the property." "Assess it for what?" Miriam folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. "I suppose we'll find out." The surveyor arrived on a Tuesday, riding a gray mare through the mud and water that had turned the access road into a soupy channel. He was perhaps 40, with a neat beard and spectacles that caught the light. He dismounted carefully, eyeing the stilts and walkways with an expression that shifted from skepticism to reluctant fascination. "Miss Vale," he said, removing his hat. "I've been looking forward to this." She led him through the bog, explaining every element of her system. The channels that managed water flow, the floating platforms that adapted to tides, the drying sheds that captured heat and breeze, the root cellars that preserved surplus through winter. He asked questions, precise, technical questions about measurements and gradients and soil composition. She answered them all, describing not theories but practices, the lessons learned through months of patient trial and failure. "This is remarkable," he said at last, standing at the edge of her largest drying shed, watching the women work. "I've traveled across the territory documenting agricultural innovations, and I've seen nothing like this." "It's not innovation," Miriam replied. "It's listening. The marsh told me what it wanted to be." Ashworth removed his spectacles and wiped them on his sleeve. When he put them back on, his eyes were serious. "The commission has been concerned about the settlement patterns along the coast. Good land is running out. Families are moving further into wilderness, clearing forests that should stay forested, farming soil that cannot support farming. We need new models. Sustainable models." He paused. I'd like to propose your operation as a pilot program. State funding for expansion. If you can replicate this elsewhere, on similar wetlands, similar difficult terrain, we could transform how Oregon thinks about agriculture. Miriam looked at the marsh stretching behind her, the water channels she had carved, the wooden walkways that hummed beneath the women's feet as they worked. She thought of the 200 acres she had claimed, the thousands more like it that stretched along the coast, ignored and despised and waiting. Replication requires training, she said. I'd need to teach others, build a school, maybe, show them that the land everyone mocks might be the land that saves us. That could be arranged. The surveyor extended his hand. Miriam shook it. Behind them, Sarah laughed at something one of the other women had said. The sound carried across the water and mingled with the cry of seabirds and the soft lapping of the tide. Miriam closed her eyes and breathed in the smell of salt and bog and cranberry, the scent of a life she had built from nothing, the aroma of possibility rising from the marshes of the Oregon coast. The weeks that followed brought a different kind of chaos to the marsh. Surveyors arrived in pairs, measuring and mapping with their brass instruments and leather notebooks. Men from Salem appeared with questions about soil composition, water tables, and drainage patterns. Miriam answered each inquiry patiently, though she spent half her time explaining what she had already learned through seasons of failure and hard-won success. The state funding came through faster than she expected, accompanied by a formal letter that named her operation the Oregon Coastal Wetlands Pilot Project. A modest sum, but enough to hire 3 additional workers and purchase the lumber needed for another drying shed. She wrote to her sister in Missouri, her first letter in 2 years, and told her that the marsh had finally become home. Sarah took on greater responsibility as the work expanded. She trained the new pickers, teaching them the same patience Miriam had taught her, showing them how to read the subtle color changes in the berries that indicated perfect ripeness. The 2 women worked side by side from dawn until the evening fog rolled in, their hands stained purple from the fruit, their conversations ranging from practical concerns about weather patterns to quiet reflections on the lives they had left behind. Sarah had abandoned a teaching position in Portland when the school board informed her that married women could not hold teaching contracts. Miriam had abandoned nothing. She had simply refused to stop moving forward. Construction began on the training school in late September, when the first autumn storms began to batter the coast. Carpenters from Coos Bay arrived with wagons full of lumber, and Miriam directed them with the same confidence she had used to direct her own digging the year before. She designed the building herself, a long, low structure raised on stilts to accommodate the seasonal flooding, with large windows that captured the salt air and kept the interior cool during the Indian summer that sometimes stretched into October. The first class would begin in spring, she announced, and she would personally instruct any woman willing to learn the methods she had developed. But even as the project grew, challenges mounted. A late October freeze arrived unexpectedly, dropping temperatures below 20 degrees for 3 consecutive nights and destroying nearly a third of the remaining harvest. Miriam walked the bog in the gray morning light, her boots sinking into the frozen mud, and surveyed the damage with a tightness in her chest that she had not felt since her first winter on the claim. The berries that had not frozen cracked and split, ruined beyond salvage. She stood alone on the wooden walkway and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of grief before she turned back toward the cabin and began calculating what could still be salvaged, what could still be done. The training school opened in March of 1889 with 6 students, all women, all with stories that echoed Miriam's own struggles. There was a widow from Coquille who had lost her husband to a logging accident and needed a way to support her 3 children. There was a young wife from Bandon whose husband had taken ill and could no longer work the dry farmland they had claimed 3 years earlier. There was an elderly spinster from Port Orford who had spent 40 years teaching school and wanted to try something entirely new before her hands grew too stiff to work. Miriam welcomed each of them to the small cabin that served as both dormitory and classroom, and she began to teach them everything she knew. The instruction combined practical demonstration with patient explanation. Miriam showed her students how to read the land, how to identify the subtle indicators that revealed which areas held water close to the surface and which would drain too quickly for cranberries to thrive. She demonstrated the construction of the shallow channels, the placement of the wooden walkways, the building of the floating harvest racks that allowed pickers to move across the water without disturbing the bog below. She taught them to recognize the different varieties of cranberry, the early ones that ripened in late September and the late ones that hung fat and dark well into November. She explained the importance of flooding the bog before the first hard freeze, how the water formed a protective layer that shielded the vines from the killing cold. Sarah served as her assistant instructor, demonstrating the harvesting techniques with the Cholian that came from 2 full seasons of work. The 2 women had developed a rhythm together, an unspoken understanding that allowed them to teach in perfect complement. Miriam provided the theory and the vision. Sarah offered the practical tips and the encouragement that kept the students working through their inevitable mistakes. By midsummer, the first class had completed its training, and 3 of the 6 students had filed their own claims on wetlands along the coast. The widow from Coquille claimed a marshy stretch near her home. The young wife from Bandon filed for a flooded meadow that had defeated her husband's farming attempts. The elderly spinster from Port Orford, improbably, claimed a tidal flat that nobody else wanted. The newspapers took notice. A reporter from the Oregonian arrived in August and spent 3 days documenting the operation, asking questions and taking notes with evident skepticism. He had come expecting a curiosity, perhaps a fraud, certainly a failure. He left with a feature story that ran on the front page under the headline, "The Marshwoman of Coos Bay." How one settler's impossible claim became a model for frontier agriculture. Miriam read the article twice and set it aside without comment. She had long since learned that the opinions of strangers mattered far less than the work that remained to be done. The second class arrived in September with twice as many students as the first. The harvest that year exceeded all expectations, filling the new drying sheds to capacity and requiring Miriam to construct additional storage on short notice. The state representatives returned to assess the progress and left with enthusiastic reports that promised increased funding for the coming year. A group of investors from San Francisco appeared with offers to build a processing facility, a proposal that Miriam considered carefully before accepting, with conditions that protected the women who worked her bog. She insisted on fair wages, safe conditions, and profit-sharing arrangements that would benefit the workers, rather than simply enriching distant shareholders. Sarah decided to stay. She had received an offer to return to Portland, a teaching position at a private school that promised respectability and a regular salary. She discussed it with Miriam over dinner in the cabin, the two of them sharing a simple meal of cornbread and preserved berries while the wind howled outside. Sarah explained that she had spent her whole life being told what she could and could not do, where she belonged and where she did not. The marsh had shown her something different. Here, her skills mattered more than her gender. Here, her choices determined her future rather than the expectations of strangers. Miriam listened without interrupting, and when Sarah finished, she simply nodded and said that she would be glad to have her stay. The winter of 1889 brought record rainfall, flooding the lower fields and washing out several of the newer channels that the second-class students had constructed. Miriam organized the work parties herself, leading teams of women into the water with shovels and hoes, rebuilding what the storms had destroyed with the same stubborn determination that had carried her through her first brutal year on the claim. The community that had once mocked her marsh now sent help freely, men and women arriving with tools and materials, working alongside the women they had once dismissed as foolish or desperate. The surveyor returned with news that the governor himself had taken interest in the project, that Miriam might be invited to speak in Salem about the possibilities of wetland agriculture. She accepted the invitation with reluctance, never having enjoyed public speaking but recognizing the opportunity to reach an audience that could translate her small success into broader change. She spent a week preparing her remarks, writing and rewriting until the speech felt right in her mouth, until she could deliver it without reading from notes. When the day arrived, she traveled by wagon and ferry to the capital, a journey of 3 days through rain and mud, and stood before a room full of legislators and officials who expected her to justify the state's investment in an unconventional experiment. She told them about her first winter, the loneliness and the doubt, the way the marsh had tested her until she thought she would break. She told them about the women who had joined her since, each one seeking something the ordinary frontier could not provide. She told them about the land everyone had dismissed, the land that had hidden its wealth in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough and humble enough to recognize what it could become. The speech in Salem opened doors that Miriam had never expected to find. State agricultural agents began visiting the marsh regularly, documenting her methods with photographs and detailed reports that would be distributed to counties throughout Oregon. She received letters from settlers across the Pacific Northwest, women and men who had read newspaper accounts and wanted to learn about bringing cranberries to their own difficult lands. She answered each one personally, her handwriting growing cramped and tired as the correspondence accumulated, but refusing to delegate the task to assistants who might miss the tone of encouragement that she considered essential. The work expanded faster than she could manage alone, and she began training other instructors, women she had taught herself, who carried the methods to new locations along the coast and into the interior valleys. Sarah assumed greater administrative duties, handling the business correspondence and managing the seasonal workers who arrived each harvest. The two women had developed a partnership that transcended the usual boundaries of frontier friendship, a deep mutual respect forged through shared hardship and common purpose. They spoke often about the future, about the possibilities that extended far beyond the boundaries of the original claim. Miriam dreamed of a cooperative, a network of wetland farms owned and operated by the women who worked them, protected from the speculators and investors who had taken so much from so many settlers on the frontier. Sarah sketched diagrams of processing facilities and distribution networks, practical plans that gave shape to Miriam's vision. By the summer of 1890, the marsh had become a destination. Settlers traveled from distant territories to see what one woman had built from nothing, walking the wooden walkways and marveling at the channels that transformed useless swamp into thriving agriculture. Miriam led the tours herself when she could spare the time, explaining the principles behind each element of the design, emphasizing that the methods could be adapted to countless other landscapes if only people took the time to understand what the land was actually telling them. She spoke often about observation, about patience, about the wisdom that came from working with nature rather than against it. The land will show you what it needs, she told visitors, if you are willing to listen. On a warm evening in late August, Miriam stood at the edge of her bog and watched the sun sink toward the distant hills. The water glowed copper and gold, and the vines, heavy with ripening berries, stretched away toward the horizon in every direction. 2 years of struggle had passed since she had first set foot on this claim. 2 years of doubt and exhaustion and relentless labor that had brought her to this moment of quiet triumph. She thought of all the women who would follow, who would find their own difficult lands and discover the hidden possibilities within them. She thought of Sarah and the students and the cooperative they would build together. She thought of the marshes still waiting along the coast, the thousands of acres that might yet be transformed by patience and determination. The wind carried the smell of salt and bog and possibility, and Miriam Vale smiled at the future that spread out before her like the water itself, vast and full of promise, reaching always toward the horizon. The harvest began on the first Monday of September, when the morning air carried the first hint of autumn chill, and the berries had darkened to their deepest red. Miriam had organized the work with the same careful planning she applied to everything, dividing the bog into sections and assigning crews to each according to their strength and experience. Sarah brought her students every afternoon after their lessons, and the children moved through the water with surprising confidence, their small hands nimble among the vines. The floating racks Miriam had designed made the work faster than anyone had expected, and by the end of the first week, the drying shed was nearly full with the first quality berries that would bring the best prices at market. Neighbors who had laughed at her claim now appeared at her gate with offers of help, and Miriam accepted their labor with gracious gratitude, knowing that generosity deserved generosity in return. The Hendersons came with their wagon and offered to haul the harvest to Coos Bay, and the Brennan family, who had once warned her away from the marsh, sent their eldest daughter to learn the work so that they might plant their own bog the following spring. Miriam taught freely, sharing every technique she had developed, every mistake she had learned from, because she understood that what she had built could be multiplied across the coastline if others were willing to try. The first shipment of cranberries left for Portland in late September, packed in barrels Miriam had ordered from a cooper in town. The response came back within 3 weeks. The berries were of exceptional quality, the color perfect, the flavor remarkable. The buyer offered a price that exceeded Miriam's most hopeful calculations, enough to pay off the remaining debt on her claim and leave a sum left over for the improvements she still dreamed of making. She wept when she read the letter, alone in her cabin with the rain drumming on the roof, and for the first time since her husband's death, the tears were tears of joy instead of grief. The cooperative took shape through the autumn months. with 7 families signing articles of agreement by November. They would share equipment and labor, market their berries together, and support one another through the difficult seasons that every farmer faced. Miriam served as organizer and teacher, spending her days traveling from claim to claim, helping the others lay out their beds and plan their water management systems. The work was exhausting, but it filled an emptiness inside her that she had not known existed, a purpose that extended beyond her own survival toward something larger and more lasting. Winter brought challenges that tested the new cooperative and reminded everyone why so few had attempted cranberry farming on the coast. Heavy rains swelled the streams that fed the bogs, and Miriam spent days walking the levees and checking the overflow channels she had designed to handle exactly such excess. The wooden walkways, so useful during harvest, grew slick with ice, and 2 of the cooperative members lost their nerve and spoke of abandoning their claims entirely. Miriam visited each waverer, offering encouragement grounded in practical experience, showing them the adjustments she had made to her own bog that would prevent the damage they feared. The spring floods came early, swollen by snowmelt from the mountains, and one of the cooperative's newer bogs suffered significant damage when a beaver dam gave way upstream and sent a wall of water across the young vines. The owner, a widow named Clara Hennessy, whose claim bordered Miriam's on the southern side, stood at the edge of the destruction and wept, certain that her last dollars had been swept away forever. Miriam walked the damaged section with her, assessing the loss with a clear eye, and then made a decision that surprised everyone. She would donate half her own harvest that year to help Clara rebuild, and the cooperative would provide labor to replant the ruined beds. The generosity cost Miriam dearly, delaying her own improvements by a full season and requiring her to take on additional work at the mill in Coos Bay to meet her own obligations. But when she saw the gratitude in Clara's eyes, the determination that replaced the despair, she knew that some investments could not be measured in dollars alone. The cooperative held together through that difficult spring, each family contributing what they could to the recovery effort, and by summer the damaged bog was producing new growth that promised a full harvest by the following autumn. The bonds formed in crisis proved stronger than any contract could create, and the members of the cooperative learned to trust one another as they had never trusted neighbors before. By the 3rd summer, the coast south of Coos Bay had transformed in ways that no one would have believed possible a few years earlier. 7 bogs stretched across 3 miles of former marshland, producing berries that traveled by ship to San Francisco and by rail to markets as far east as Chicago. Families who had lived on the edge of poverty now spoke of prosperity, and the children who had learned to harvest cranberries alongside their parents had become experts in their own right, knowing the work as naturally as they knew the tides. Miriam's cabin had grown into a proper farmhouse, with a stone chimney and glass windows and a porch where travelers often stopped to hear the story of the marsh that became a fortune. On a warm evening in late July, 1891, 3 years after that first desperate harvest, Miriam sat on her porch and watched the sun set over the bog she had helped to create. The water reflected the sky in shades of amber and rose, and the vines swayed gently in the evening breeze, heavy with the green berries that would ripen to crimson by September. She thought of her husband, gone now 6 years, and wondered what he would think of the life she had built from the ruins of their dreams together. She thought he would be proud, and the thought brought her peace instead of pain. a gentle gratitude for the path that had led her here. The knock at her gate came as the first stars appeared, and Miriam rose to find a young woman standing in the yard, travel-worn and uncertain, clutching a worn leather satchel to her chest. She introduced herself as Eliza Foster, recently widowed, with 3 children and no place to go and little money left after the journey south. She had heard stories about a woman who had turned worthless swamp into prosperity, and she had come to ask if perhaps there was room in the settlement for another family willing to work as hard as the land demanded. Miriam invited her inside, fixed her a plate of food, and began that very night to explain the principles that had guided her own transformation. The next morning she walked the marsh with Eliza, showing her the channels and the beds and the gentle slope of the land that made everything possible. She explained how the salt water mixed with fresh, how the bog adapted to the rhythm of the seasons, how the berries grew best where conditions seemed most impossible. By the time they returned to the farmhouse for midday dinner, Eliza was asking questions that revealed not just hope, but understanding, a grasp of the principles that would guide her own journey. Miriam wrote a letter of introduction to the cooperative that afternoon, and by the following spring, a new family had joined the settlement, and a new bog had begun to take shape along the southern edge of the marsh. Years would pass before Miriam Vale was ready to rest, but when she finally slowed her pace and let the cooperative carry on without her daily guidance, she knew that what she had built would outlast any individual life. The cranberries still ripen along that stretch of Oregon coast, harvested each autumn by families whose grandparents learned their trade from the first settlers who trusted a widow with a dream and a difficult piece of land. The bog stretches on, patient and generous, a testament to what one determined woman could accomplish when she refused to see impossibility, where others saw only ruin, and chose instead to imagine what might yet become.